Facebook. Hi, Lap of Love family. I am Christiana, one of the grief coaches here at the Pet Loss Support Team. I'm so glad that all of you can join us either in this live or will be able to see this video a little bit later. I'm really excited. I'm here joined today with the renowned author, editor, as well as the founder of the quote verifying website, quotenick.com. And we are here to talk about her newly launched first of a kind book, the book of Pet Love and Loss, Words of Comfort and Wisdom from Remarkable People. And this has quotes and stories from people throughout history of the last 2 centuries that she's compiled, from Fred Rogers to Billie Holiday and Helen Keller. So I'm really excited. I know that the book really spoke to me. It was recently released in July. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. And we will take some time. Sara has been gracious enough to offer her a few minutes of her time at the end. If anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to kind of look at any comments and discuss those. But to go ahead and get started with this discussion, in the intro of this book, you share that your inspiration for creating the first of its kind book, as I said, for bereaved pet parents in your own search for comfort in pet loss was after losing your sweet kitty, Snowflake. And I think it's only fitting that we start by talking about her. And so I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about your sweet girl, your experience with pet loss, and how that inspired you to create this kind of book.
So Snowflake and I sort of inherited each other after the end of a long relationship. And my boyfriend moved out and Snowflake stayed. And it really wasn't until the 2 of us were living together that we formed a really deep bond and friendship. She actually turned me into a cat person. Like before Snowflake, I liked animals. I really respected animals. I was endeared to them, but Snowflake was like the one who really turned me into a cat, and I have to say dog person as well. Just a little bit about her. She was super dignified, very patient, incredibly polite. She was like the most polite cat. Often in the mornings when I was sleeping, I would wake up and she would just be quietly watching me sleep, waiting for me to get up to feed her breakfast. Like she never.
Oh, you don't always get that from cats, that's for sure.
No, I'm sure at some point speak to my current adorable cat, Pearl, who's the exact opposite. But she was just a lovely, dignified, extremely just beautiful soul. And we became very close. And over the last, I'd say like 9 months of her life, she was getting progressively thinner, and something was going on. I was bringing her to vets and trying to figure it out, and no one could quite figure it out. And the weight kept dropping, which I know this is probably a common experience where it's just heartbreaking when you pick up your pet and they're just a little bit lighter, like week by week. It was slow and it was super painful. And by the time I brought her to a doctor who did figure it out, they found a mass that needed to be operated on. They thought it was probably cancerous, and that she might not. The risks were very high because she was extremely thin. So the vet suggested, for her sake, that I needed to say goodbye, because they just didn't think she had dropped half her weight by that time. Anyway, this is all very depressing, but it will become life affirming as the conversation goes on. But I was prepared. I mean, I had plenty of time to prepare for the end because she was sick for so long. But when I said goodbye, and in the days, weeks, months after, I was a total wreck. I was a wreck. I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping. And I was really surprised by sort of how debilitated I was. I knew I would be sad. I knew I would be mourning her. I did not know I wouldn't be eating. I did not know I wouldn't be sleeping. I didn't know how much it would affect me physically, and emotionally, of course. And so I'm an editor and a writer, and what I usually do in these situations is I look for books that can help me through hard experiences. And I looked for books on pet loss, and there's so many good ones out there. But my stamina was so low, like what I could handle in that situation was so, I just couldn't handle very much. I couldn't handle reading a book of essays. I couldn't handle reading a book about sort of the process of pet loss and sort of like a narrative nonfiction. I wasn't really thinking about the Rainbow Bridge, that particular visual. I know that connects with a lot of people, but that was hard for me to connect with. So I started looking for, and I love quotes. I mean, that's been a longstanding love of mine. So I started to look for quotes by people, cultural icons and figures who I admire, who I knew were animal lovers, who'd been down this path and who had written about it, just to make myself feel like I wasn't like losing it and that others had been through this, and had not only been through it, but because they're such fine writers, they had written beautifully about it. So I started collecting quotes, and at some point I realized like there's so many beautiful quotes, and it was a really, I felt like, beautiful way to help people through the experience without a huge heavy lift of like a book of essays or sort of a more a denser, really important book on pet loss, but one that I personally wasn't ready for.
Yeah. And you mentioned, you said this is really depressing, but we'll get life affirming. And I think that really is a transformation and experience of grief if we allow it to be, and we search for that purpose that we feel like we've lost in our grief. And, grief brain is a real thing. It really is this idea that we can expect our, top cognitive selves to be at 100% when we're in the midst of grief is not realistic. And, so I always say, take that really high expectation you have of yourself down just a little bit, and it's okay. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, and that's why we have this book here. And it really is a disenfranchised grief. People are not usually prepared for how heavily they'll be grieving. And I think it's because a lot of the quotes that you put in this book, even so far back in history, we think that pet loss is like this new thing, but it's really not. It's just that hasn't really gotten much airtime.
Yes.
Right, when discussing these people and their stories in history.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Eugene O'Neill talks about his dog Blemmy, and he says something like, I knew I would miss him, but I'm paraphrasing, but I had no idea how much. Mm-hmm. And it was very comforting to just not only like find quotes about the pain of pet loss, but to find quotes specifically about people who were as shocked as I was. Even though they knew, they were prepared, they're bracing themselves. But I found that it was a common experience to be completely stunned.
Yes.
And wrecked and flattened. So that gave me comfort too. I felt like, okay, I'm not alone. And not only am I not alone, but I'm in really good company.
Yes, exactly. And you break the book up into 5 chapters that kind of go down, distinct trails in pet loss. Would you mind kind of sharing what those chapters are and why you broke it down that way?
Yeah. So I really didn't want to only write a sad book about pet loss. One, I thought that I would be like clinically depressed by researching it for several years, but that wasn't the main reason. The main reason is I feel like the loss is so heavy and deep because the love is so intimate and deep. And so to talk about one, I feel like I wanted to talk about another. I mean, the other side, the love. So the book really starts, the first 2 chapters, there's actually no talk about death, really. The first chapter is called A Circle Around Us Both, and it's really just about the joy and the love of that we share with an animal companion, and it's just a really joyous chapter. Each chapter has a different color associated with it, and that chapter is sort of like a reddish pink, more red, but just sort of a bright, very optimistic color. And then the second chapter is called Their Time Must Come, which is starting to get a little heartbreaking. And that's sort of an orange color. And that is really about watching your animal become like more frail, move more slowly, take more naps, take this, like look at the stairs instead of running up them. Just their hips are sort of unhinging a little more slowly. Just you're sort of watching like the gray start to show up on their fur. So you're sort of watching it, and you're kind of in some of them. In a quote by Edward Gorey, the artist, he said like he was shocked that they were getting old. He thought they were really young still. So sort of also the surprise that even though you've been with them for many years, you just can't believe that they're getting on with years. So it's really about sort of the observation and witnessing them getting older. And then the third chapter is called It's Tough to Lose Your Shadow, which is really the center of the book. And that's really like right after you say goodbye to your beloved pet. So that's really about the shock and a lot of this, what we just talked about, sort of being disoriented. And May Sarton called it a volcanic eruption of woe that she experienced coming back from the vet, and that she was so disoriented she forgot to pay and had to go back to pay for that last visit. But the idea that you leave the vet with an empty carrier is just like that center chapter. It's very sad, and it really is like the heart of the book. And then that's blue. That chapter is blue for obvious reasons.
Fitting. Yeah, very fitting.
And then there are 5 chapters. So the 4th chapter is called The Persistence of Mourning. And that is really, and I think it's different for everybody. And some feel it more than others. And it lasts longer for some than others. But just sort of how mourning can really persist and not be something you get through quickly, that it takes a long time. And so that's really quotations and stories about people who are like hearing their pet at night still, and sort of the feeling that the pet they haven't sort of come to terms fully that their beloved animal is no longer there with them. They're still sort of cycling through the heavy grief. And then the last chapter, that chapter is kind of like plum colored, starting to get brighter. And the last chapter is sort of a yellow, and it's called The Final Gift. And it's really sort of an homage to the friendship and to what the animal gave you, and what you gave the animal. And it's not a tied up. I didn't want to tie it up with a neat bow. There's some quotations about people feeling like they're getting ready to welcome another animal into their life. Others are like, I'm just not there. But sort of the mixed feelings, but sort of the larger tenor is just the gift of the friendship. So it does take you through an arc. Yeah.
Yeah, in that last chapter, it makes me think of there's a model of the 6 central needs of mourning, and one of them is finding meaning. And in the beginning of grief, that sounds preposterous, right? But as we move through it, we're able to reflect a little bit about what this meant in our lives. And in the 4th chapter, The Persistence of Mourning, one thing I appreciate about this book is that you can actually learn so much without feeling like you are being lectured to. And in grief, grief is that internal feeling after a loss, and mourning is the outward expression of that grief. And in this section, there are so many different examples that show how things like writing letters or doing memorials to their loved ones really brought them comfort and helped them get to a place of acceptance and you know, figuring out how to move forward. So I really appreciate that part of the book, that it was really educational if you're there and you are ready to absorb that without, you know, like I said, feeling like you're being lectured at. And I'm curious about the research journey that you went on through for this, because it couldn't have been easy. Wondering how long it took and how you were able to find so many of these relatable quotes and stories.
Yeah, I mean, the book, I think when you like hold it in your hand and you look at it, it can feel like sort of this straightforward, like, I don't know, I find a very satisfying object, the book, but it feels like sort of this neat package, but it was actually a very surprisingly challenging research assignment for me, or not assignment because I didn't feel assigned, but like journey for me. I really started it soon after Snowflake died, which was, believe it or not, in 2012. But so I started sort of collecting quotes then, but then I'm a book editor and I got a staff job at an art publisher in Manhattan, which was very all consuming. So the idea that I could kind of work on a book and work on all these other authors' books was not realistic. So I sort of put it aside, and then I returned to it several years later. So the publisher and I sort of came to an agreement in 2019, Simon and Schuster, and then it released in 2023. But you really sign off on a book almost a year before it comes out. So it was really like 3 years of intensive research. And I guess the biggest challenge for me, but also the most exciting one, which I love because it's such a treasure hunt, is typically people are very embarrassed by how intensely they feel. So much of the excerpts and the quotes I found were very buried, like they were buried in letters and journals and notebooks that were published, but some were out of print and a lot of them weren't indexed. So you really, you know, you couldn't go to the back and necessarily look up the pet's name and be like, oh, on page 213, I'll find, you know, what I need to find out about, you know, Rusty or whatever. You really had to sort of move through the letter collection and try to find. It wasn't always the case. Sometimes they were indexed. But when they weren't indexed, the names weren't indexed, it did make me think, like, it's wild that like best friends of these people were indexed, but not the animals. So it was very like, it was poignant to know that some of the animals didn't make it into the index. But you really had to sort of I had to go through the letters carefully. I had to go through the notebooks carefully, the journals. And then when I would find one, it was just like the best, because you really feel like you're on a treasure hunt. You find that one line or two lines in an entire book. And I would take those excerpts out and I don't know if this is too tedious to describe, but I created a gigantic spreadsheet and I would add it to my spreadsheet and tag the quote as to sort of what point in the process that quote fell into. And then I just kept collecting and collecting. And I would look, I mean, it was a little tricky because famous people who love animals don't always write about them.
Yeah.
And then famous people who love animals who write or talk about them don't always talk about the grief part. Yeah. So it was like this Venn diagram of needing to find cultural figures who had great reverence and friendships with animals who actually took the time to write about it. So that's what I looked for. And then I sort of slowly moved through their works. And that was the written part. And then podcast and interviews, that was also a part. And then social media more recently. So it really felt like a collage. And once I had this enormous spreadsheet, I sort of started to piece together The chapters, which started as 7 chapters, moved to 5. It was a very sort of it was a really interesting process for me, and I would say the hardest book of research I've done to date. And I think because the subject matter has been such a private one.
Yes, and that really makes me think about our culture's overall relationship with death and grief. We kind of don't talk about it as much as it exists. Like I say, there's two kinds of people in this world: people who have been through grief and people who will be through grief or will go through grief. And so, in general, people typically don't share that anguish. And then add a disenfranchised grief like pet loss. You say some people are embarrassed or they don't, want to share that. So I can only imagine the deep dive that you have had to do. And I'm incredibly grateful that that was a way for you to put purpose to your pain, and kind of gift this to the world to be a record of validation, that you're not going crazy, you're not alone, this is valid, this is painful, and it's also nothing new. So I am really glad that you decided to take this on, and I'm grateful for that. Were there any stories or quotes or anything that really specifically or in particular resonated with you?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do in the book is to add some levity. So Raymond Chandler, who was a prolific letter writer, wrote a lot about his cat Taki, and that personally resonated with me because my cat now, Pearl, is a real character. She's very different from Snowflake, and she reminds me a lot of Taki, who was a total diva, and would like lie on Raymond Chandler's manuscript pages that he wanted to revise. Like she would lie on them and not let him get to them. And she was just sort of like very, I want to say high maintenance, but that's not a positive way. She was just a diva, and they loved her dearly, and they loved her diva quality. And when they tried to bring another kitten into the home, Taki threw up and basically was like, I'm the only one here.
No,
So that was not allowed. So reading about Taki just on a personal level brought some levity, but also reminded me a lot of Pearl, who I love, who's also a diva. But then sort of more poignantly, Helen Keller's, she had dogs throughout her life, and they really grounded her and made her feel safe in the world. And she talks about her deep friendship with those dogs, and there's a beautiful photograph of her with one of her dogs. So that we've heard so much about Helen Keller, I have, over the years, but I have never really heard the story of her and sort of like the arc of her and her dogs. So I found that to be really memorable. And I would say also Jane Goodall, who, we associate so much with her work in Tanzania, but she talks about her dog Rusty as being sort of her first mentor, and the animal that taught her that that animals have feelings and personalities and minds. And when Rusty died, she said it was like more devastating than any animal she's worked with. He was like her first mentor. So there's so many. I feel like it's almost like impossible to choose, but I feel like Raymond Chandler brought a lot of levity, and Helen Keller just brought a different side to. I just found it very life affirming, and she's a beautiful writer, and I loved reading about her, and I loved reading about Jane Goodall and Rusty and what Rusty meant to her. So those three sort of stick out, but I could talk about all of them, really.
And what that really makes me recognize is that it depends on the day and how you're feeling in that moment with what you're able to relate to. So it's a book that you can really go back to and pick something else up that maybe didn't, strike you the first time, and then really relate to it when you read it again. Like, this idea of with Taki, accepting for somebody as they are, just
Yes.
accepting them as they are and loving them. And with Helen Keller, with especially people who are, people living with disabilities of any kind, there is a lot of comfort because there's no judgment there, right? They don't
Yes.
care about that. They love you. They're not comparing you to what is what you're supposed to look like. Is we can feel that. We can take our emotional armor off when we're with them and really, feel that vulnerability and that trust. And then the idea of your first pet just being,
Yeah.
somebody in your life that is, really is a pillar to your story. So that is, like I said, one of the things I really appreciate about the book is that it really just depends on where you are in your journey, and you can always go back and you're going to take something else and feel connected to a whole other person.
Yeah, and I think because it's divided into different stages, I feel like someone who just got a puppy probably doesn't want to spend a lot of time thinking about the end of that puppy's life, but could really love the first chapter of the joy of getting an animal. And so you can kind of drop into the book. There's like a ramp for everybody. I feel like depending on where you are with your relationship with your animal, and then when you're in mourning, I feel like you can drop in, but you can also read the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, Now, one thing that you said in chapter 2 that really spoke to my heart is that our animal companions are here not only to teach us how to live, but to teach us how to age and ultimately die. With quotes of owners just remembering how their pets had such grace going through this phase in their life. And I'm specifically remembering a quote from Elizabeth Gilbert in which she states that they show us that it's not as scary as we humans make it out to be, that they're so good at this and humans are so bad at going through this.
Yeah. Yeah, that really touched me too. I feel like I'm going to keep that in mind for sure, forever. Yeah, I wrote down a Dean Koontz quote where he talks about the bright desire to make the most out of life in spite of the limitations of age and disease. I love the bright desire to make the most out of life. And I feel like, when animals are aging, they still have that bright desire to make the most out of life. Um, and there's so much courage in their fight when they're really fighting a health crisis, because they don't even know what they're fighting. They're just
Right.
in it. And Laurie Anderson talks about sort of as they're aging and getting older, sort of taking time to just sit in the sun more and just sort of soak up life. There's so much to learn from these animals, and they don't perseverate. They're not sitting around thinking about what it's going to be like when they're gone and what they should, a will. And they're
Right.
not thinking about all of the anxieties that humans are spending time thinking about when they're very ill and they know the end is near. So there's just something so pure. And I love the bright desire to make the most out of life. I feel like that's what they do, and that's what they teach us. And also, as Elizabeth Gilbert says, they're good at letting go. They're good at letting go, and they're not anxious about it. And what you do, your organization, is just such a gift and a blessing, because it allows them to let go in an environment where they're safe and comfortable. So it sort of leans into what they're good at, which is letting go. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes when we go through anticipatory grief, there can feel like there are losses along the way. Like maybe you lose your running partner or something like that, but there's also gains if we choose to see them that way, like having a partner to just appreciate the sunshine on your skin as you lay out back with them, taking those moments to slow down in such a busy world. And so it's kind of a reminder that, maybe they can't do all of the things that they used to do, but what they can do they're going to be present in that moment and soak it in, especially
Yeah.
if they're with their people.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that really just resonates deeply with me.
Yeah, and they're not cataloging what they can't do, it seems. They're sort of just they're leaning into what they can do still. And I feel like if more of us did that, as we age, it would be a much more optimistic time.
I agree with that. And you've touched on this and somewhat answered it, but as a self-proclaimed quote queen myself,
Mm-hmm.
I really love quotes, and I know that you do as well. So, what do you think it is about reading similar experiences from familiar names in history that really brings us comfort?
Um, well, they're familiar voices, so I feel like that's very helpful. There's a big difference between reading a beautiful quote by someone who's a familiar voice and reading an equally beautiful quote by someone you've never heard of. I feel like there's something that it just feels more connective when you're familiar with the person, even if the quotes are equally beautiful. It just there's something that resonates more for me when I have the context of who said it, um, or wrote it. But I think one of the great gifts is just getting a window of on these familiar people. Like, there's such a tenderness in these quotes, and you get to see a different side of these cultural figures that you love and admire, and it sort of makes everyone feel like just humans. It sort of takes them off the pedestal, and just there's a sense that it's like one big pet loss support group, and it doesn't really matter if you've written a Pulitzer Prize winning book. Like, we're all in the same boat. We're all here to help each other, and there's just something very, I feel like, human and life affirming about hearing John Steinbeck or Edith Wharton talk about a feeling that you have, and in a way that is articulated so beautifully.
Yeah, and we do have a tendency to do that. We kind of put people on pedestals, and they're like, oh, well, they can't be going through the same things that I am, and then to recognize, like, yeah, they're human too, just like me, and these are very human reactions to this kind of experience. And
Yeah.
empathy is really rooted in this feeling of familiarity.
Yes.
And I can see how, we can feel more of an emotional connection and empath, with a little bit of familiarity to kind of put it in context. So
Yes.
that really makes sense to me.
And it feels like a group you're in. Like, I mean, pet loss is such an isolating experience. I feel like, even if you know that other people, even if you sort of get to the point where you know that other people feel intensely, you're just have such a singular relationship with your animal that it feels so specific to you, and it's a very lonely experience. So I feel like reading all these voices talking about that same feeling, just, I don't know, it eases the isolation. I think it did for me.
Yeah, and that's a good point about, it's a very singular, intimate relationship with our pets, and not only is it disenfranchised grief, but also typically we are the ones who are grieving the most, about losing our pet. So I hadn't thought about that until you just said that. So now our last question today, if you would be willing to share with us, keeping in mind that everybody is allowed to believe, we're not telling anybody what to believe, but I'm curious about your personal thoughts about the afterlife of pets.
I mean, that is such a mystery. That's such a mystery. I will say that I feel the same way about Snowflake as I do about my father, who died in 2014, just a couple years after Snowflake, which is, I feel their energy very much, and I feel their presence with me, um, all the time. I feel like they're a part of me, but they're also a part of, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I don't know if everyone can relate to the feeling of energy being out there, but sort of this collective energy that they've sort of become part of, but also I feel like they're looking out for me and sort of looking over me. So in that way, it doesn't feel so specific as it feels like this very comforting sense that they're still with me. And I feel it about my dad and I feel it about Snowflake. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, but
That absolutely does. And
and
you know, the fact of the matter is energy cannot be created or destroyed.
yes,
Right?
I and also this book, I mean, I felt connected to Snowflake while writing this book, but I feel like every time I talk about it, I feel like she's with me. Um, and she's with me all the time, but it feels like she's kind of front and center every time I have a chance to talk about her. So I think one of the isolating things about grief too is that we don't have opportunities to talk about the animals that we loved and lost. It's not like, over lunch, uh, in the break room, all of a sudden you can start talking about the animal you love. Like there's specific context where it might come up, but it's such a blessing, I feel like, to be able to talk about her and to stay connected to her in that way. And I really tried to take an extremely difficult time for me and create something beautiful that will help others. And I feel like that's really Snowflake's legacy. Um, so her legacy, I feel like, lives on, and I feel her energy. I would say those two things.
Yes, that's the exact word I was thinking of, is just what a powerful legacy that inspired this really just labor of love. Um, so I just think that that is just so powerful. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to just talk about this book and this issue of pet loss and you know, that it's really not this cut and dry thing where, you know, here, read some books about it and you'll be fine. So I think it's really a gift to the entire pet loss community that you have given in honor of Sweet Snowflake. Where can people find your book or and to get a copy for themselves?
So I've been really heartened actually in a lot of independent bookstores I've been going into. I've seen it there. So stores like that and Barnes and Noble obviously are carrying it. Bookshop.org. I usually tend towards the independent bookstores, but I think maybe the best bet is to go to the Simon and Schuster page for the book, and it has links to different ways to purchase it. So yeah, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about it. It means a lot to me.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we have somebody that is going to post the link in the comments. So we'll have that in the comments, the Simon and Schuster page, so that you guys can go and check that out. And I just want to take a minute. We have a couple comments just to respond to you guys. Bill Marcus says, we always talk with the owners first, answer all the questions, and take care of all the paperwork and transactions before we move on to the final goodbye. So I'm thinking that this is a veterinarian or want somebody who works for Lap of Love. And I think that that's definitely important. You know, you don't want to be making decisions and, you know, at the afterwards, you know, pulling your credit card out and all that stuff. So having that taken care of ahead of time is really important. And Faith says, lost my doxy in March. I didn't think I could go on. In May, I got a pup to help my grief. I have never got a pup that soon, and now I feel guilty because I don't know if I took time to grieve my sweet girl. I love this pup so much. She is what I needed to go on. She was born the day after my girl died, and she is a reincarnation of her. Mannerisms are the same, and it's a great feeling to think she is still here with me. I'll never forget her, but now I don't dwell on her death so much. Wow, that goes back to, you know, what Sarah was saying is you know, when she was first describing her inspiration from the book of just it can feel really just depressing and sad, and it kind of allows us to go through that process. And you know, the thing about humans is that we're dialectic, right? We can have two truths exist. We can love a new friend and still be grieving. Did you have any of that experience when you got Pearl?
Yes, I did. I did. Um, I would say to that is I feel like we're here to love, um, and the more we can do that, the richer our lives are. And I think there is no timetable. I think if you need 5 years, if you need 10 years, if you need 10 days, um, I did feel that I waited a few months, I think, but I don't think I was thinking too much about. I think Pearl kind of dropped into my lap in a way, um, but yeah, I love the idea of bringing another animal into your life in honor of the one you lost, so that they're connected. Um, I love that idea.
Yeah.
So I think it helps also ease the guilt. Even though I don't feel like the guilt, anyone should feel the guilt, even though I know everyone does. But I feel like they've diplomatic immunity. They don't need to feel the guilt. But I think it does ease the guilt to feel like this new love is not a replacement, but it's a reaffirmation of our ability to love, really.
Yes, that's so powerful. And it's also when we're ready and getting a new pet, it's kind of the legacy of the one who passed, right? Because our pets help shape us. They
Yes.
help shape us into who we are and our confidence in being pet parents and taking all that we've learned and all of that love. It's always going to be intertwined in any love you put forward. So it's not like jumping from one to the other. It's like one long, it's like braided in, it's intertwined in the love that you have moving forward.
Yes, it's a continuum. I totally believe that. And I feel like, I mean, Pearl is so, this is a little bit of a diversion, but she's so clear with her needs that I feel like I've learned a lot about sort of communication through her. And Snowflake was very patient. And so I feel like each animal's like a best friend. They bring out different sides of us, and that side is just with us forever. So yeah, I think one of my hopes for the book is that it will help people kind of move through the grief, not in a speedy way, but in like some people say they like cry hysterically when they're reading the book, especially like the third chapter and the fourth chapter. But I think that's like really hydrating and spiritually hydrating. And I think that's really important. And I think that helps us get through the grief. So um, my hope is just I am contributing to the continuum of love, I would say.
I would say that you absolutely are. And if anybody has any more questions that may be watching this later, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have any questions specifically for Sara, I will absolutely reach out to you, Sara, if that's okay with you,
Of course.
to answer these questions. But feel free to continue commenting. I know that some people will be watching this a little bit later on, and I just want to thank everybody who just, felt compelled to be here with us today. And I want to thank you, Sara, so much for taking this time to talk about this labor of love, as I call it, and just this gift to this pet loss community that you really have given. I'm extremely grateful for that. I'll hold the book up one more time for everybody to take a look. It's hardcover, it's beautiful. And on the front, you can even put it in memoriam to the one that you love. As you can see, I have lots of bookmarkers in there. But thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you, Christiana. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate it. It's been a total pleasure.